Hello, I'm Dr. David Chudwin, and I'd like to talk to you about episodes from my book, The Magical Decade. I'll conclude this fourth video discussing the development of the environmental consciousness during this time. On March 11, 1970, I was at Chrysler Arena in Ann Arbor. The venue was packed with over 13,000 spectators. This was not a Wolverine basketball game or a rock music concert. I was there covering it in person for the Michigan Daily. Because of my interest in science, I became the lead reporter on environmental issues. The event was the kickoff rally for the ENACT, which stands for Environmental Action for Survival, teach-in, a 5-day happening. There was an electrical atmosphere as attendees understood this was a historic event, the formal start of a movement to save the earth. I could sense the hopeful and enthusiastic attitude of the crowd. They were mainly students, but the audience also included faculty, politicians, and community activists. The keynote speaker was Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, a pioneer in addressing environmental issues. He called for financial, social, and ethical changes to meet the environmental crisis. Others who spoke that night included ecologist Barry Commoner, entertainer Arthur Godfrey, Michigan Governor William Milliken, and University President Robin Fleming. The teach-in had opened on March 10th with workshops and guerrilla theater in Ann Arbor. The next day, before the kickoff rally, I watched a mock trial of an automobile on the Diag, the central square of the university, on charges of pollution. After a mock trial guilty verdict, the car was sentenced to death and was smashed by sledgehammers. I remember the sound of glass cracking as the windows of the sacrificial car were bashed in. On March 13th, there was a 4-hour marathon panel about the causes of pollution, which filled Pioneer High School's auditorium and gym with a noisy crowd of over 2,500 people. I also covered that event for the Daily. Senator Edmund Muskie was the principal speaker. Muskie received a positive response, although he faced some radical hecklers in the audience. The brunt of the heckling, however, was for Walter Reuther, president of the United Auto Workers, and especially for Ted Doan, president of Dow Chemical Corporation. Dow is widely reviled as a source of pollution in Michigan and elsewhere. During the final day of the ENACT teach-in, consumer advocate Ralph Nader spoke to a capacity crowd of 3,500 in historic Hill Auditorium on campus. He warned against corporate violence and said corporations need to be held accountable for pollution. That night, a final summary panel was led by Gary Mayor Gordon Hatcher. Before the ENACT teach-in, I was not up to speed about environmental issues. However, the space program, in which I had a long-time interest, contributed to my understanding of the environmental situation. In particular, the views of Earth from the moon affected the perspective not only of the 24 astronauts who had voyaged to the moon, but also those of us on Earth who saw them. The Apollo 8 crew, with their famous Earthrise photograph snapped by Bill Anders in 1968, especially revolutionized public attitudes about the Earth. Seeing a small ball in the vast cosmos with a thin layer of atmosphere and no political boundaries gave a new environmental perspective. Down here on Earth, I had personally encountered a variety of environmental problems during the magical decade. Air pollution was one of the most visible issues. Some of the major sources of air pollution then and now are automobiles, factory, and the energy sector. In 1970, in the middle of the magical decade, the Environmental Protection Agency was first established by President Nixon and Congress. The EPA established new standards for auto emissions and fuel economy. Besides automobiles, factory were another source of air pollution. When I lived on the south side of Chicago, we were only a dozen miles west of the U.S. Steel plant in Gary, Indiana. We would pass that environmentally dangerous and grimy industrial complex driving east to the Michigan dunes or Indiana or Michigan. There was a foul odor in the air, and chimneys belched smelly toxic fumes. Factory effluent also played a role in water pollution. A prime example was the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. I was in Cleveland in 1971 for a summer internship on the copy desk of the Cleveland Press. The river, which was foul-smelling from factory waste. It actually caught on fire in June 1969. The energy sector contributed to pollution by burning coal, fuel oil, and natural gas. Home heating had transitioned in the 1950s and 60s from coal to oil and then to natural gas. When I was a young child, there was an oil tank in the basement of our house in Chicago, which was filled each heating season. Our new house in the suburbs used natural gas, which burns more cleanly and is less polluting. Regulations and laws passed during the magical decade have yielded tangible results. These have included less air pollution, reduced reliance on coal for electricity, greater use on natural gas for heating, more efficient trucks and autos, cleaner lakes and rivers, and preservation of wetlands. More recently, environmental issues such as Keystone Pipeline and offshore oil and gas drilling leases were again in the headlines half a century after the magical decade.